Wind hunted the battlements of Winterfell and found 1,000 old cracks to sing through. Snow did not fall so much as root itself in the air, white seeds adrift and unending. In the gods' wood the pool wore a thin skin of ice, and the weirwood's red leaves were heavy with frost. Jon stood among them with his gloves off until his fingers hurt, his breath a pale animal that rose and vanished. The old face in the tree watched. He did not pray, not in the way he had as a boy. He looked and he listened. The silence after a storm had a shape to it if one kept still long enough. He thought of horses stumbling through drifts, of hearths gone to ash in the mountain villages, of 1,000 empty bellies. Winter had come. He could not order it away any more than he could order his heart to be other than it was. What he could order was bread. What he could change was how long his people lasted. He was not alone. Boots crunched behind him, sure and unhurried. "You've been standing where the others kneel, your grace," Braavosi said, not intruding on the sanctity of the place so much as acknowledging it with a lowered tone. He had pulled his hood back so that the snow caught in his beard and thawed on his old sailor's face. "I'd counsel you to put your gloves on if you plan to keep your fingers through the winter." Jon managed a thin smile and did as he was told. "You served Stannis," he said. "I did." Davos's mouth twitched as if at a jest only he could hear. "And I learned what it is for a realm to be short of coin and shorter of bread. There's a ship's rule. Men can forgive a captain anything if their bellies are full. Run out of biscuit and they'll begin to question the stars." Jon gazed at the reddened mouth of the tree. "The North won't feed on words. We've sent foragers to the foothills and sent men to trap the rivers. It isn't enough. It will never be enough if we search only where we've always searched." Braavosi stepped closer and dropped his voice. "There's grain eastward. The free cities are fat with it. They've had no war on their own streets. And there are men in Braavos who sell winter as if it were silk. They'll do it for a price. The Iron Bank lent to kings who could die in a day. It'll lend to you if it suits its sums." Jon closed his eyes for a beat. The pool under the weirwood had taken his face and blurred it. Cersei sits the Iron Throne. The bank will want their due from her. The bank wants what keeps it whole. Davos's hand settled on a low branch as if steadying himself for an old pitch. "They might lend to her hand in the morning and to yours by supper if both deals pay. They'll sell the same ship twice if they can manage the papers. Let them. You're not asking for their love. Ask for their ships and their grain and their letters of credit. Take a loan that buys more winter than your enemies can stomach." Jon turned. The snow beneath the weirwood was an untouched sheet except for his own boot prints and Davos's. "If we starve the South, we starve families too. We're not laying siege to a city with hungry babies," Braavosi said gently. "We're buying the bread before the queen can. If she won't pay honest, she'll pay dear. Her armies eat before her people. It's her custom. Take away her larders and the men who swing swords in her name will remember their mothers. Kings fall when the rationmaster fails. Queens too. There was truth there, as harsh as snowlight. Jon felt it like iron in his hands. "We'll need Manderley. White Harbor will have to become the mouth of the wolf." "Aye," Braavosi said, "and a fat mouth if we can manage it. I'll speak to Lord Wyman with you. He knows the taste of brazen coin and salt, and he's as shrewd as any we'll meet across the narrow sea. But we must move now. Every day we delay, some captain sells his cargo to another buyer." Sansa appeared as they left the godswood, her cloak catching at her boots, her hair bound tight against the wind. She seemed a flame banked under wool, steady, contained, bright. "Did you call a council without me?" she asked, a mock heat in her words that did not hide the earnestness in her eyes. She studied their faces and then their hands, as if the shape of the news lay in the way their fingers clutched their gloves. "We've called winter," Braavosi said. "We're arranging how to feed it." Jon briefly explained. Sansa listened without interrupting, only the faintest tightening at the corner of her mouth betraying thought. "You would borrow from Braavos," she said at last. "And if the Iron Bank finds Cersei the better bet, then we will be one of their bets," Jon said. "They hedge. We can use that." Sansa's gaze moved from him to Davos and back. "You will need promises to lay before them," she said. "Collateral, right? They will ask for a pound of us." "They will," Davos agreed. "So we give them what we can afford. Port tariffs at White Harbor pledged until the loan is repaid. Timber rights from the Wolfswood limited by the Weirwood Groves and the Manderley seal upon it, and the promise of peace on their captains in our waters." "They'll want more," Sansa said. "They'll want to set terms that bind you like a snare." Jon felt the shape of what she truly said. He nodded. "You'll help untie the knots." Her mouth eased. "We will need granaries that won't leak," she said. "Trusted men to count weights and guard locks. Ration lists written and sealed by a hand all will obey. And we will need to show our people the first sacks quickly. Hope sours faster than flour." "You speak as though you've counted the loaves already," Davos said respectfully. "I have counted empty plates," Sansa replied. They assembled a small party, a handful of guards, Davos with his sea knowledge, Maester Wolkan with his orderly mind and seal wax, and Jon himself because it was his word to spend, not another man's. The road south to White Harbor was lined with drifts that swallowed carts if the drivers strayed, and the sky had a low belly loaded with weather. They passed frozen streams where boys were thumping ice to test their courage and girls were plaiting the ends of furs tighter, faces turned away from the wind. They passed fields studded with blackened stubs where last autumn stalks had been cut and burned. Wolves howled at night, and sometimes Jon thought he heard an answer far off and deeper than any throat of flesh could make. White Harbor was not white so much as winter pale, the stone softened by cold. The Merman's court was warmed by braziers so large a man could stand within them for a moment and come away singed. Lord Wyman Manderley rose to greet them, though it took effort, and he smiled with his eyes before his mouth. His beard was a white wave. He was as dangerous and kind as a harbor in a storm. "You bring winter into my hall, your grace. I mean the honest sort, hungry and blunt. Sit." He waved a hand that had known wealth since birth and war since yesterday. Sweet wine steamed at their elbows. Roasted fish sent up clean smoke. Wyman's rings clicked against his cup as he poured. "Ser Davos, you've sailed more coasts than I have cooks." "I," Davos said, slanting a look of admiration at the Lord. "And I've learned you can smell a bad cargo before the barrel's cracked." They set out their plan. Wyman listened and did not interrupt. When they were done, he looked at Jon for a time that was not uncomfortable. "You mean to use the bank that once thought my forebears not worth a dock line," he said at last. "Fitting." He tapped his fat finger on the table. "You will pledge my tariffs? Be sure that when the bank comes calling for their tithe, they know the Manderleys guard their own purses with the same zeal as their guests. Still." He leaned back, belly as grand as any sail. "I have harbored Braavosi galleys before. They are polite and prickly, both. They'll respect a ledger in which every number knows its place. We'll make granaries. We'll assign the counting to men whose fathers died for this city when the Krakens came. We'll stamp every sack that enters my warehouses with the dire wolf and the merman both, so no rogue thinks to sell them out the back door. And I'll send word to Gulltown. There are Vale merchants with long memories who still trust the North more than the Iron Throne." "Your seal on the collateral?" Davos asked. "My seal," Wyman said. "And more, my ships will carry our case to Braavos, and my son will captain the lead. Look about you." He opened his hands. "The winds will take the roofs off shepherd huts this month. We'll put our sails where they can do the most good." They spent 2 days in White Harbor swallowing plans and exhaling orders. Sansa's letters arrived like flakes themselves. She had begun to reorganize Winterfell's old storehouses, to hire carpenters to shore up roofs and coopers to mend casks. She had sent the Glover men to watch the road for thieves and the Mormonts to stand inside the granaries, where anyone tempted to steal would find 20 bear cloaks glaring at the notion. She had chosen women as well as men to tally the sacks. "Women have been counting for longer," she wrote, in a hand like threads pulled tight. "Trust that." In the end, Jon sailed. He went because Davos asked him to, and because the weight of a name on a paper by some lord's cousin could be argued to dust if a king's eyes had not been laid on the man who had signed. The ship Merman's oath creaked like an old mare made to canter, but she ran true. The sea was a black pane hazardously thin in places. The crew sang under their breath as if not to wake something asleep just beneath. Jon had never liked ships, but he bore them. When the Titan of Braavos rose from the snow-hazed sea, his first thought was that the world made gods of what it feared. They entered the city through a maze of masts. Ragman's harbor lifted its smells like banners. Pitch, fish, spices. Men from 100 coasts shouting in a dozen tongues. The Braavosi wore bright hats that looked foolish until one realized they shed snow well, and their swords curved like questions. Davos moved through it like a man at home and yet not. His mouth softened by old memories that let him plot a course by the angle of warehouse roofs. He took Jon to a low house with a door that had been sanded to a finish like bone. The man who met them had a face set in a slight smile that never reached his eyes. "Tycho Nestoris," Davos said and bowed.
"Ser Davos," Tycho replied.
His accent made a music that flattered and mocked simultaneously. "You once made a king with your tongue. It is good to see the instrument is still in tune." Davos grinned. "It makes a poor music compared to the banks, though, which can summon fleets and unmake realms." Tycho looked to Jon. "And you are the snow who became a king without a bed to inherit and without a robe of silk to ratify it. Braavos respects unanticipated sums." "Sit, your grace." Jon sat. Tycho's chamber was not grand. It was warm. There were ledgers stacked like towers, and a small hearth in which a fire burned with a disciplined flame. Davos laid out their terms first, as was the way among merchants. Pledge White Harbor's tariffs until the loan was repaid. Assign a portion of timber rights to the bank for ship repairs. Guarantee safe harbor and fair dealing for Braavosi ships in the White Knife. The bank would in return extend letters of credit to known factors in Volantis, Pentos, and list to purchase grain outright on the North's behalf and to load it for White Harbor and Gulltown, appointing captains to convoy it under the bank's protection. The loan would be repaid over 7 years with penalties if a payment were missed and with an early completion bonus if they paid 2 years early. Tycho's thin fingers shuffled papers. Jon watched him watch Davos, watched the way his gaze measured what wasn't said. When Tycho asked his first question, it was to Jon. "You know the bank lent to a queen last season. The gold she sent us from Highgarden came early, and we are not in the habit of insulting repayment by refusing it. What keeps you from being a coin tossed aside if her treasury fills again?" "Winter," Jon said simply. "Grain does not grow out of pride. The South cannot harvest anything under a pall of frost. Cersei has no grain of her own to sell, and the Reach won't feed her for love. She will try to buy calmly at first and then frantically, and she will find the prices are as harsh as her rule. The bank will profit either way." Tycho considered. "If we transport grain to you, we risk ships. If she hires corsairs, we risk more. Then convoy them under your own flags," Jon said. He forced himself to truly meet Tycho's eyes. "There are pirates brave enough to seize a cargo from a Westerosi lord. Few will deliberately cross the Iron Bank unless you wish them to vanish. But if she does strike at you, it will be because she believes you already chose a side. And all we ask is that you choose the side where the sums add up." Davos made a small motion, as if to ask permission to be bold. "You know the Queen's habits, Tycho. She pays a debt today by making 3 for tomorrow. She will try to fix the price of bread to appease a riot, then mint a new coin with a cheap alloy to pay her guards, and then borrow again to pay the mint. Each measure turns profit into panic. A steady customer is worth more than a glittering one." Tycho's smile increased by a hair. "Ser Davos, if I were a weaker man, I would fall in love with you. The bank is not moved by speeches, but the bank is moved by the sight of a plan that cannot fail in 3 seasons." He pushed a parchment forward. "We will extend a line of credit for grain purchases in 3 cities. We will charge the usual fee for conveyance and insurance. We will require the tariff pledge and the timber rights. We will require that you pledge to accept certain Braavosi coin for payment in White Harbor." Wyman had warned this might come. Accepting Braavosi coin within the port meant the bank could flood the city with its own money and draw back a portion in kind. It would also anchor the bank's presence there more deeply than a treaty did. Jon felt Sansa beside him, as if her hand had found his shoulder at a fire's edge. He nodded. "We accept your coin in White Harbor." "One more clause," Tycho said. He spoke lightly, but it fell like a hammer. "A promise that should the Iron Bank call on you in good faith for an enforcement of contract against any debtor who is your vassal or guest, you will assist in ensuring the debtor meets his obligations. If the bank is to keep your granaries filled, it must be able to seize a barrel when that barrel is ours." Jon's jaw cabled. He pictured a fisherman whose boat had been financed by some distant factor, coming to the harbor to find his catch seized. His children crying in a tongue he could not. He heard Sansa again. He heard Davos too. "Be careful where you agree to place the chain. We will help you enforce lawful contracts in our harbors," he said at last. "But only those that do not demand blood. No man will have his children taken under a northern precedent." Tycho spread his hands. "We do not take children, your grace. We take ships." A pause. "You are wise to be clear." He drew another scroll from his shelf, and wax and seals began to multiply. By the time they left, the light had gone to steel and the Titan's head was lost in mist. Davos's mouth wore a long-suffering triumph. "I've signed worse deals and better lies," he chuckled. "We'll need to write to Lord Wyman about the bank's coin. He'll roll it on his tongue to see if it tastes of cloves." They moved with a precision born of fear. Wyman's letters flew north at the same speed as the first ships eased from their berths in Volantis under the eye of Braavosi factors, their holds damp and smelling of hops and last year's spices. Captains were told where to sell and where to avoid. Bankers' boys with quills wrote tallies under awnings. Safe conducts were distributed to men whose courage had grown out of profit for so long that they disliked honest war. In White Harbor, the granaries were filled with sawdust to keep the air drier, then emptied and scrubbed with vinegar until even the old rats coughed. Coopers reshaped hoops. Blacksmiths set iron locks. Wyman set his fattest son in an office above the quays with 2 clerks and 3 guards and a pot of thick stew. He shared with every man who brought him a paper to sign. He grumbled loudly over the bank's coin and stamped every paper with the Merman's seal and the direwolf overlay, the 2 imprints slightly off such that any forger would have to fake not 1 stamp but 2 and the error between them. Sansa rode as far south as the last river and back, her red hair shining like a bright thread in the gray. She set up distribution points in the villages, a longhouse on each road with a double padlocked door and a list of households nailed at its threshold, a woman with ink-stained fingers to hand out chalk tallies that could be exchanged for bread each week, a man in rough fur to stand beside her and keep peace. She had coppers melted and recast into stamped discs that fit neatly into a palm, good for loaves only, useless to any thief. She put Lyanna Mormont's fiercest cousin in charge of cataloging the names on the lists and told him he could beat anyone who said the Bear Isles could not count. Jon visited the forges where Gendry, who had come north with Davos because he'd wanted to swing a hammer somewhere an honest man could breathe, mixed his sweat with locals, shaping more arrowheads than beauty, more nails than artistry. Jon stood by the first sack that was stamped Direwolf Van Merman, the cloth stiff, the ink not yet dry. He held it like he might hold a pup or an egg. He thought of the Weirwood's mouth and the Titans. The first convoy arrived in a slant of cold rain, not snow, the white knife taking on the gray of rivulets pouring from decks. The Braavosi galleys came in sleek as trout, oars rising and falling with a grace that made men on the quays still their own breathing. Foreign flags flared in the wind and flattened. Grain smelled like hope and mice. Men began to cheer before the ropes were cast. They fell on the sacks with a hunger that had nothing to do with bellies, hauling them to the warehouses, stamping them, tallying them, sealing them. Wyman himself lifted the first mouthful of bread baked from the new flour. He ate it without butter and wept. In the south, the winter that came to King's Landing did not whiten rooftops, but it crawled under doors and settled in joints. The sea was not kind, the wind not kinder. Cersei wore black against the season as if mourning and empire could be stitched of the same cloth. She stood on a balcony under a sky that could not make up its mind to rain or to be stone. Jaime found her there, and the crows on the city's roofs watched them like accountants. "We are short," he said without shifting his weight, as if the admission had to be smuggled into a sentence. Rosby's carts were taken by a Riverlands levy that claimed we had no right to requisition them. Duskendale's harbor master demands coin for every cask and more for every hour we make him wait. The crown's price for barley was called fair a fortnight ago. This week they call it robbery. Cersei didn't look at him. They will call whatever cuts their own palm a robbery. Her mouth was a hard line. Raise the price we pay our soldiers. Lower the price for bread. Take the difference from the smith's allotments. The smiths forge the nails that hold the gates to their hinges, Jaime said, almost patiently. He had learned tonelessness when dealing with her, as if he were speaking to a tightly strung instrument. Lower the price of bread and bake. Arras can't afford flour. They'll shut their ovens. Then seize the ovens, Cersei said. Distribute the bread from the Red Keep kitchens. Let them line up where the gold cloaks can see them. Lines are order. Qyburn hovered a yard back, his hands folded, his voice soft as velvet left in a tomb. There is another matter, Your Grace. The Iron Bank has increased the discount on its letters of credit. Factors who once extended us 90 for 100 now offer 87. Those who bid for grain in Volantis do not like our coin as well as they did a month ago. Then hang a factor, Cersei said without heat. Send the head back with a note reminding them what happens to those who cheat a crown. Qyburn's smile was a closed thing. Those heads are easily replaced, Your Grace. The habit of calculation is not. We turn away from merchants today, and tomorrow their brothers will cut their prices for our enemies. Who? Cersei asked and turned at last. Daenerys wears dragons and dreams. She will not eat us with copper. And the boy in the north, what is he? He inherited a wooden crown and a wolf. He is not in my hall. Sometimes a man who is not in one's hall has hired the cook, Qyburn said, a little rueful, and Jaime looked away because he knew Cersei's ears would hear treachery and truth if it came through that mouth. News came in drips. A ship that had been bound for King's Landing turned north when its captain discovered the guild there would pay him in Braavosi coin worth more in pentos than any chancellor's promissory in the capital. An ally in the Crownlands, once fat, now sent only letters and apologies. The gold cloaks went to sweep the market near the river and found not the course of bread but a rush of men with stones. The stones were not large. The panic was. The Lannister levies in garrison at Harrenhal and along the Blackwater took to watering beer too thin and cutting meat with oats. That was a soldier's stew when the corners were clean, but nothing had been clean since autumn. The men began to sell fittings from their own armor. A missing buckle did not itch as much as hunger. A company of sellswords hired by a Lannister cousin went to the Queen and asked for their pay in advance because they'd heard talk of coin clipped at the mint. Cersei had 3 of them beaten and sent the company away without pay, believing she'd taught them a lesson. The lesson they learned was that other armies paid in bread, if not gold. Euron Greyjoy prowled the narrow sea in his black ship, his eye an old wound, his smiles as honest as a storm's promises. He took prizes under any flag that had grain in its belly and money in its future. When his reavers fell upon a small convoy with Braavosi pennants among them, he laughed and forbade the capture of the bank's ships. He burned a Reachman's cog instead and left the Braavosi to count their breaths and their luck. He knew a line he could dance on, and he liked his feet on its edge. He sent a single sack as a gift to the Red Keep and slept with the woman who delivered it standing on one leg because it amused him to see her wobble. The bank doubled its guard on its convoys after that, not because the Greyjoy wolf snarled one of their galleys, but because he had not. The threat that had not bitten yet was the one that made men count their fingers every morning. Tycho Nestoris wrote 3 letters for everyone he had before, and 2 of those crossed the narrow sea not in ships but in pockets. Word slid into Winterfell that Euron had taken a brace of merchantmen meant for King's Landing and turned them back with their holds empty. Word came that he had let another convoy pass untouched and had laughed at it. He's feeling how far his hand can be thrust into a hornet's nest without coming out stung, Davos said, bending over a chart like a man examining lines in a palm, reading life there. Never fear the man who fights like a mad dog. Fear the one who sniffed 100 doors and only howled at the one that makes every neighbor pull his shutters. Sansa had men in King's Landing too. Not spies in the way of mummers and murderers, but women who had baked for noble houses and were now turned out, who had married guards and heard coin counted. They sent little news that sounded like news. It was all detail. Flour stretched with bean meal, bark sold as spice, streets where the dogs were all gone. The royal kitchens had started a soup line near the Red Keep and had ended it 2 days later when the crowd trampled a boy. The Queen's men had beaten the baker in Flea Bottom who raised his price when he was told to lower it, then had gone to him the next day because they liked his crust better than any ration loaf. Jon took these pieces and pressed them in his palm until they made a shape. "The armies will be the last to feel it," he said. "Lords always feed their men and themselves before their cities. But soldiers have mothers, and they have sisters who carry pails. A man will let himself go hungry longer than he will watch someone he loves grow thin." He was not wrong. A man named Butcher Tom, who had been a boy beneath Lord Tywin's banners once and now wore leather with a lion sewn on his breast, put down half his ration when he came home and found his wife had kept a bowl of bones to boil twice. He walked to his captain and asked for leave to go to the Reach to buy barley for his household because he had a cousin near Bitterbridge and perhaps that cousin still had a patch of field. The captain laughed and told him the roads were worse than any enemy. Tom knocked him down. It was over in a spit of a second. A thing done before it had a name. They clapped Tom in irons and the next day 4 men did not appear for drill. The day after that, 10 were missing. Bread lines became lightning rods for weather both human and other. When the wind was in the east and wet, the lines were quieter and longer. When it shifted north and bit cheekbones red, the lines were short and mean. Men measured their lives by the half-loaf. Inside Winterfell, heat and hunger were not words that opened into unbounded hollows, but ones that could be counted and sealed. Sansa stood over a ledger with Maester Wolkan and the Bear Island cousin and drew lines through names. Those who tried to take twice were struck through and had to come to her for reconsideration. She called them in one by one. "You took a second loaf last week," she would say. "Tell me why." "My daughter's lying in with a babe who came too early," a man would say. "One son's off with Lord Glover and the other gone to his gods when the cough took him," a woman would say. Sansa would listen and weigh and undo some lines, and leave others. Jon moved between the tasks like a man between fires, warming one hand, then the other. He went to the forges in the mornings and stood near the granaries in the afternoons, and at night he slept in a room where the window panes clicked as the ice expanded and contracted like old bones. He had thought the work of war was only the battle itself. He learned that it was the dullness between and the numbers on a page and the way one argued with a banker about the rate of loss on a voyage. Ravens came. From the wall a grim wing beat. Eastwatch sent word that a storm had thrown up 1,000 shards of blue ice on the shore like knives planted by a giant's hand. From Queen's Crown, a village asked for seed and then asked no more. From the south, more interesting letters. One had a drop of candle wax on it that had been perfumed with something empty and expensive. It told them that the Queen had ordered 11 carts bearing grain to be turned back from the Gate of the Gods because the merchants had refused the new stag coin. Another said that the gold cloaks had seized the ships of a Pentoshi trader and declared them forfeit to the crown. The trader had slipped away in the night and gone to Braavosi to complain. Tycho's reply was 3 words longer than his usual, and that was how Davos knew it was important. He read it and his mouth flattened. "The bank's patience is not endless. They expect us to continue to keep our end of the bargain. We must send another payment against the loan early to keep them sweet. They're extending more credit for purchases than they promised, at a cost. That cost will be felt in every measure of flour after 2 years. We'll pay before 2 years, Jon said. And Davos tilted his head the way a man humors a friend at a dice game. They did, though. Not because the North grew richer but because the South grew poorer, and grain could be bought with less coin when it was paid for with surety and with winter pressing on half the world. A second and third convoy came under bank flags and under the eyes of Wyman's sons, who had learned the Braavosi words for waterline and leak and cheap very quickly. Gulltown sent 3 barges down the coast to White Harbor with their own grain, purchased in a bargain made in a signed room among men who had done business in their father's day when the direwolf was not yet resurrected on the northern walls. In King's Landing, the Queen had the baker hanged in the market when he raised his price a second time. The rope frayed and the man fell and broke his leg. And the crowd laughed at him and then at the gold cloaks and then stopped laughing altogether when the captain ordered his men to make an example of those who laughed. Jaime found Cersei with her hands clenched so hard the knuckles were white. "The laughing will be louder tomorrow if the men kill for a loaf," he said. "Then kill for two," she said, her eyes a color one could not choose in a dress. "Feed the laughter to itself." He had no answer she would hear. He went instead to the stables and soothed the horse with his left hand until the animal stopped dancing, and he thought of the snow he had seen once in the riverlands and the taste of it on his tongue. He thought of something he had told a woman in a hot bath many years ago, that he had dreamed of a quiet place to go when the shouts went too high. He remembered she had laughed then and that the laughter had been sweet, not like this kind, not like the other kind, and he shut his eyes until the horse's breath clouded his cheek and warmed it. Autumn's leaves had long since blown away, but a different sort of color whipped about the masts in White Harbor that month. The splotchy blue and gold of Braavosi pennants and the pure white of the Manderley's lamps. A Lysini captain with rings through his ears and a tattoo of a woman whose eyes moved if one looked long enough bargained with Wyman's factors for 3 days over the price of oats. Then bent and kissed the seal with the merman on it when the deal was struck. Sansa walked the quay with Davos at her shoulder and let the captains see her and think what they would. Some stories moved faster than ravens if they were told by eyes. She spoke to sailors' wives and to girls who had learned to carry baskets on their hips and to boys running messages for the clerks. She saw that the men who unloaded the grain got the first loaves and that the men who kept the ledgers were never the same men who held the keys to the locks. A cart was stopped on the road north with a false bottom that concealed flour bought with someone else's tally and meant for a clandestine sale to some lordling near the Bar Rowlands. The driver pleaded and the 2 men with him swore they had hungry cousins. Sansa stood beside the cart while Lyanna's cousin looked impassive as a rock. She told them that even hungry cousins must stand in line, and she had the flour redistributed to the nearest longhouse and the men put to work mending fences and hauling wood for a month. "Let every thief do 2 honest men's work," she said. "Let them pay with their hands." Jon heard murmurs that he'd bent the knee to a lender instead of a southern queen. He learned to recognize the sound of envy in men who had not been given the heavy part of leadership and the sound of honest concern in the ones who had. He met with lords who told him timber rights were theft and then agreed to the terms because they saw the sacks stacked to the ceiling and smelled the bread baking. He sent men to the villages that still whispered of Ramsay and renailed their doors. He spoke to the Night's Watch and sent them carts of flour to be hauled to the wall before the road vanished. He listened to Tormund grumble about bread with no meat in it and then watched him eat a second loaf. When the first snow in King's Landing finally came, it came in a powder that did not stick, riding stinging wind that drove grit into eyes and left cheeks raw. Children tried to catch it and found it tasted of salt and smoke. Old men spat at it. The queen ordered the old tapestries burned to warm the great hall and told herself that she had never liked their colors anyway. The gold cloaks began to sleep on the kitchen floor near the ovens. A thin priest who had neither sept nor flock climbed upon a barrel in the market and shouted that famine was the god's way of thinning a flock with too many black sheep. He lasted until a woman threw a pebble that struck him in the mouth and made him bleed. Temples had been blown up and burned and taken, but prayer had not ended. It turned private and fierce, to small gods and small needs. A girl in flea bottom prayed for a heel of bread. A soldier prayed for another officer to be the first to step forward. A baker prayed that his hands would keep steady while the queen's men watched him measure. The Iron Bank announced that it would no longer accept any coin from the mint unless tested in a certain way and stamped with a new mark. The mint raged and stamped, and the bank smiled the way ledgers smile when they know the other man's figures are off by enough that a whole city begins to lean. Tycho sent Davos a brief that was as cold as any wind. A list of contracts delayed or defaulted, a schedule of convoys, a prediction of where prices would be if the winter held. Davos showed it to Jon. It's like watching the tide. You can shout at it and it will not listen, or you can mark on a stick how far it will go. What happens when it reaches the mark? Jon asked. Davos's shrug contained the sea. Everything on the beach gets wet. Jon did not much like being compared to a stick in the sand. But he spent a whole night at the inner parapet of the Winterfell wall watching snow swirl like gulls. and he decided that he could accept a city's anger and a queen's spite if it kept his people's children with color in their lips. Leadership tasted like hard bread then and a little like ash, and there were nights he lay awake and heard the wind say names he'd lost. He had chosen a war that did not loudly kill, but it killed all the same. He had chosen it because the war coming would kill everything, loud enough to swallow even regret. Ravens came from Dragonstone, black on black. Tyrion Lannister's seal was one of them. He wrote with a hand that Jon imagined had held a cup of wine while it moved. The gist was this. The Dragon Queen intended to press her claim upon the Iron Throne in the spring, when any sort of campaign had become a madness. But the war would be short if the city was starved and the Queen's garrison stayed in their tights. He congratulated Jon on starving a little for them. He might have even meant it. Jon sent back a reply through Braavosi that said the dead were coming and that kings and queens could debate their chairs after that. He kept his words plain, and he did not ask for dragons to escort grain ships because a dragon was not a banker and would burn first and count later. The convoy that Euron finally struck had 3 bank flags among its sails and 6 merchantmen that did not. The night was a broken plate beneath a purple bruise of cloud, and torchlight made everything look as if it might be bleeding. Euron came out of the dark like a fish that had learned to fly. He hit the leading ship and the behindmost almost simultaneously, and his men set grapples with a glee that had very little to do with hunger and everything to do with the pure pleasure of taking what had belonged to someone else. The Braavosi fought with the training of men who had been told since boyhood that death interfered with repayment schedules. 2 sank, and 1 limped to White Harbor with a third of its cargo and with bodies in its hold along with the grain. The city went quiet when it came in, as if every man, woman, and child had placed a hand on their own stomach and counted. Tycho sent a letter that did not accuse and did not rage. It simply altered a number. The rate on the loan increased by a small increment measured in ink and heartbeats. Braavosi looked at it and then looked at Jon and did not bother to curse. "The bank never bleeds when it can bruise," he said. "We can still keep our bargain. We can still feed our people. We will simply be paying for this bread even when we are eating another year's. Then we'll take more from her," Jon said, and felt it. How a man hardens against an enemy he does not see and becomes something more like metal than like flesh. He made himself go to the longhouses the next morning and hand loaves to children. He made himself stand still while they hugged his legs and then ran off. He made himself listen while an old woman named the men she had buried in her life and told him that this loaf tasted like a warm memory. And he smiled at her because that was what kings did when they had nothing better to say. Cersei received Euron with a promise in look if not in mouth. He bowed in the way of a man who had never bent in his life and said he had thinned the convoys so the bank would think twice. "They won't starve you," he said, all grin. "Not while your enemies eat, or they'll have no customers later. They'll keep feeding you, dear, at a price." He liked the way the word dear did 2 jobs there. She told him he was clever and then told Qyburn to tour the pantry. Qyburn came back with quietly astonishing facts that did not astonish Cersei nearly enough. Rats eating done bread more efficiently than people, rot under the outermost layer of a barrel, a baker's wife with a belly not full of child but of water swallowed to make her feel as if she had eaten. Cersei ordered a new tax on salt. "If a man can preserve a meat, he can afford to pay its price to his queen," she said. The city groaned around her like an old ship in a gale. The next fighting was not on the sea or at the gate, but at a line outside a ration house. The line had been orderly once. Someone had said something about someone cutting and someone had shoved. Whether the shove was first or the cut no one would remember afterward. When the captain of the gold cloaks came with his men and a voice commanded dispersal, the crowd did not move because their hunger weighed more than fear. Then a child was trampled, and the crowd began to move for real, like a thing that had awakened and discovered it was strong. Jon heard of it a week later in Winterfell, from a woman whose sister's husband's cousin had written on a scrap of rag and smuggled it north in the lining of a glove. He pictured it, the lurch and the scream and the closing in. He had seen battles where men had killed for honor and coin and fear. He had never seen one where men had killed for bread, but he could imagine it well enough. He went to the gods' wood that evening and put his hand on the weirwood, and he told it what he had done. He did not ask for forgiveness because what was there to forgive? He was feeding his people. He asked instead for strength not to look away from what the choice cost. The night after that, Tormund came to him with a face like an exposed root. The dead were seen by a trapper near Hardhome, he said. He says. He saw them as if it were a dream and then woke up with frost on his beard so thick it broke when he laughed. He didn't find the traps. He found only the prints of his own boots. Like a trick, he spat into the snow to make the story less like a ghost. He's either lying or mad, but I've learned that lies and madness are better guides toward death than a map. Jon nodded as if the words were snow settling on something already covered. We'll send calls to the mountain clans. We'll pull men from the bar Rolands. We've fed them. Now we'll ask them to give that strength back. He rubbed his forehead. The South will not march on us while their kitchens are empty. Good. We can look north and not fear a knife in the spine. Unless the dragon girl looks this way, Tormund said. She will look at the throne, Jon said. She will look where the bread is not. He said it like a hope, and he knew it for one. He spoke with Sansa long that night. They sat with a single candle in an alcove where tapestries had once hung, and where the stones smelled faintly of smoke from a life ago. If we must pull grain from the granaries to feed men at the wall, he said, we will be thin by spring. Sansa sipped her broth and threaded the steam with attention. Then we must take more. The bank is not a cow that gets milkier by affection. But if we pay early again, we will be able to ask to extend the line. You must write to Lord Wyman and have him demand a discount for paying early. He will not get it, but he will get something we do not know to ask for. And we must send word to the Vale again. Lord Royce is old iron. He'll not see his men starve because of a king he did not elect. You think of all the pieces, Jon said with a little wonder. You see the board. I was once a piece, Sansa said. Now I am the hand that moves. It is a better position. He wanted to tell her more. About Braavo's and Tycho's thin smile. About the way the Titan had seemed to watch him when the mist came down so that he had felt accounted by stone. Instead he said, I am glad you are here, because he did not allow himself more. The snow deepened and then crusted and then fell again. Men walked from village to village on paths shorter now because they were lines drawn across white instead of roads winding around old stones, and the shortest path between 2 points is the one hunger draws. Little by little, the granaries grew less loud when one slapped the side. Little by little, the soldiers in the south increasingly addressed their officers with respect that had an undertone like a saw chewing through a knot. A child in Winterfell was born and baptized by the weirwood and called Bread. People laughed at first and then did not. The name took as a kind of joke one tells as armor. A woman in King's Landing named her child Hope and rocked her until the crying stopped and the breathing with it. Names were prayers and curses both, and winter wrote them on every door. When the great cold rolled down past the wall at last. Not the wind that bit or the frost that traced leaves in windows, but a thing that made water, seas, and air seem to have a weight. It found the north ready enough to stand. Not comfortable, not rich, ready. Men who had eaten bread 3 months in a row without a meat day did not run faster because of that, but they did not drop as quickly either. They sent arrows where they had to and burned the dead the same tired hour. In the south, a queen counted coins that built nothing but time. Before the first clash against the ice, Jon stood upon the wall of Eastwatch and breathed in air that bit as if he were an apple, and he thought of the Braavosi ink that had become this. Grain was not glorious. Men did not sing about sacks, but the sacks had become a winter's armor. If the dead that walked ever learned to count, he thought they would make fine bankers. They would never forget a debt. He smiled at the sky and saw no answer there. Cersei Lannister dreamed of crowns. She woke to ledgers. The fingers she had around her city tightened and found they were closing around sand. She ordered more men to the gates and found there were fewer men to obey. She promised meat and gave broth and then water. She decreed that the rabbits in the king's private gardens were not to be touched and found their nests empty. The Golden Company, who might once have been brought from across the sea for her, counted the sums and decided to wait for spring. It was not a siege by catapult that put cracks in the Red Keep. It was a siege by absence. The baker stopped baking. The man who drove the cart lost his ox. The ox had been sold by the guard who once watched the baker because his wife had stared at him with a look that undid armor. Every little strike was a small hammer on a great wall. No one saw the wall tremble until the dust fell. Sansa took a letter one day that bore no mark she knew and held it to the candle until the letters showed. Ink under ink. It told her that the queen had sent 3 riders to the Riverlands to demand tithe, and that 2 came back with their horses eaten under them by men who looked like farmers and had the eyes of wolves. "The realm remembers how to resist," she said, handing the letter to Jon. "Starvation is a teacher. It teaches bad lessons and the good ones last longer. If we live to learn them," Jon said, and went to meet the men from the mountain clans who had come because the raven had their names in its mouth, and because they had surprisingly found bread waiting for them. He stood before them and did not speak of honor. He spoke of food and fire and keeping a body between the wood line and the ones who would freeze it. He did not shout. He spoke the way he had spoken to Tycho, with numbers where a belly might hear them. 2 loaves today and a third when your watch is done. 3 days of warm before you go out again. The men nodded. They understood the mathematics of hunger. Braavos stood at his side when it was done and rubbed his hands together as if he could warm them with the friction of counting. "When I was a smuggler," he said, "I always thought kings played at war with gold in their fists for toys. Then I watched Stannis and I learned that a king is a man with a very heavy bag and a lot of people asking for a coin out of it. You found a way to fill the bag without any being minted. I never thought I'd live to see it." Jon watched his breath vanish. "It won't win the war. It bought us time. If you live to spend time," Braavos said, then smiled at himself. "Listen to me," sounding like a banker. There were nights when the cold and the darkness pressed so hard the world felt like a chest banded with iron. In those nights, if Jon slept at all, he dreamed of Braavos' straight streets and canals that did not freeze and men with hats and curved swords, and he saw Tycho pressing a seal into wax with the finality of a man extinguishing a small flame. He woke with his chest lighter, sometimes, as if something had been pressed there and taken away. One morning, when the sky was white and close and every sound had to push through wool, a rider came from the south with news that was 3 days old and more dangerous for being stale. There had been a riot at the mud gate, and the gold cloaks had broken, and the Queen's Court had closed its doors and burned the bridge between the keep and the lower city to stop the crowd. The smoke from that burning had fed 1,000 lungs with bitterness. 100 had died in the crush, and the rest had learned that even their queen feared them. Jon read the letter with a stillness that was heavy. He handed it to Sansa. She read it and did not smile. "This is what you wanted," she said softly. "Not this, never this, but the lack of armies. The queen cannot march on us. She cannot send a host to the neck. She cannot strip her walls of men when her city shakes under her. She will send a few riders perhaps, a letter with threats, a messenger with bitter words, and then she will turn back to her kitchens and their emptiness. We starved her armies," Jon said, and the weirwood beyond the window cut the world into red and white. "Aye." He could not help seeing the child in the crowd at the mud gate and the woman with the pebble in her hand and the rope that had frayed. He could not help seeing, also, that the faces of the men arrayed on the ice northward would never hunger or make riot. They would only come on unless someone stopped them. He set the letter aside as one sets aside a loaf. The look of it mattered and so did the weight, and both had to be preserved. In Braavos, Tycho Nestoris warmed his hands over a brazier and put another pebble upon the scale of a world. He did not think of the soldier called Butcher Tom or the little girl in the line outside the ration house, and he did not think of bread of Winterfell. He thought of interest and of return and of the way the North had become a reliable client who paid early and asked politely for nothing that could not be given if the sums were right. He liked reliable clients. They made new tally marks in a tidy column. He wrote one last letter of that season, signed, sealed, brief. Acknowledgement of early payment, slight reduction of rate as a courtesy. A suggestion that in the spring ships could be bought cheaply from captains ruined by a hungry winter. He did not say he had come to like the thought of the boy king who was honest and rude to obstacles both. or that he had imagined in an unguarded instant a realm where the bank had offices meant to last a generation and not to burn after a year. He was not paid to imagine. He was paid to read sums, and the sums spoke well of this winter's gamble. The wind sang through the cracks of 1,000 halls and huts and palaces. In one, a queen leaned over a ledger and wrote a figure and found the ink lighter than truth. In another, a wolf king stood with his glove off against a tree that bled red sap and felt the cold bite each finger in turn. In a city of canals, a banker pressed wax and dinars and whispers together. In the high air north of men's maps, a shape without heat moved across snow that did not squeak under its feet. Hunger scratched everywhere. Some fed it, some fed on it. The world balanced itself upon those acts. When the first real battle of the new winter came, a long white line against a shorter dark one, the men of the north fought with bread behind them and frost ahead. They did not break as quickly as they might have. Somewhere far south, in a city that smelled of rot and perfumes at once, men fought for bread with knives. There were no victories there, only ration loaves that cut like stones. Jon remembered the look on Tycho's face when they had signed, some blend of harmless and predatory that had itself been a lesson, and he remembered Davos's hands splayed over a map like a man reading fate. He held on to those faces while he fought. He held on to Sansa's careful calm while he gave orders. He held on to the rasp of Wyman Manderly's voice when the Lord had said, "My seal and my ships and my sons." He felt all those people as if they were standing in a circle around him in the snow holding, not owing, not asking, the only sort of circle that mattered. The story the bards might tell later would have dragons in it, and snow that fell like a curtain and dead men who rose in spite of decency. They would not tell of sacks or stamps or pen strokes. They would not tell of a queen who found rage an insufficient meal. But when a small boy named Bread pointed at a soldier's ration and asked for a bite and the soldier broke it cleanly in half and handed it to him, that was a song too, sung in plain bread. The men of the north did not go hungry that winter. In King's Landing, hunger became a crown of thorns no one could abide wearing long. And across the sea, the bank added a line to a book and closed another. Winter advanced as if it had always been coming and had merely been delayed by manners. Jon's choice did not stop it. It did not even slow it, except in the way it slowed the hands of those who would wield knives behind him. But that, in the end, was the difference between standing and falling. Grain is a small word for a world. He had learned that watching the Titan through snow and the weirwood through ice. He would remember it when he had no time to remember anything else. The godswood at last took him again in a moment when the long night felt thin. He had come from a council, an accounting, and a field where the dead had been burned. He stood with his glove off and his fingers knew not to shake now. "We will not starve," he said to the tree, and heard in his own voice both relief and penance. "She will." He knew that was neither justice nor injustice. It was the accounting that had to be done. The face in the bark did not answer. It did not have to. He had made his choice in Braavos when he had gone into a warm room and laid his name down in ink and in future. The winter would take what it would. He would take responsibility for the rest. Snow fell like pages closing. He stood with it and he did not look away.